Boker Tov, Rabbi Kahn.
Good morning.
Tu B'Shvat. I know it's your favorite holiday.
One of the many. No, today. First of all, Rav Huntner once said, or he's quoted as saying, that most of the world doesn't understand what pure joy is. The ultimate level of joy is when a Jew goes to shul on a Monday and Thursday, and right after Shemona Esrei, they say Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, which means they skip the long Tachana. And there's no joy in the world like that. So,
Right.
So everybody was very happy this morning in our socially distanced, hopefully very healthy minyan.
Yeah, Bezrat Hashem should be healthy. Anyways, in this week's Parshat Beshalach, I really wanted to discuss with you many things. I find, well, this is actually one of my favorites to read because I think it encompasses so many things that are crucial, I think, to our narrative, to our story, to personalities of Mitzrayim, the Jews, of Moshe, of Miriam, so many things to me that are very important. But I have a pressing question that I think I've asked you in the past that has been bothering me for a long time. And
I just lost you.
Yeah. Oh no.
You've I lost you then. Yeah, try again. Go ahead.
So you can hear me now.
Yes, I didn't hear the question though.
So my pressing question, the most important thing that I would like to discuss is the fact that, okay, so now we're starting in Beshalach and we're told when Pharaoh sent the nation out, and the whole thing from the beginning was God told Moshe to tell Pharaoh to let them go for 3 days so they can serve God in the desert. Bring Olot Zvachim or Lechgog or whichever one. It mentions time and time again when Moshe is going to Pharaoh, let us go for 3 days that we can serve our God in the desert. And now the question is, obviously, they didn't end up going for a 3-day period. They ended up with the mass exodus, left, never came back. And was this something that was really supposed to occur? Was it just a ruse? And either way, whether it was really supposed to be plan A, or even if it was something that they were just saying, was it incumbent upon them to actually fulfill this, to after 3 days, after they left, to bring Ola or Zvachim or something?
Okay. So, yeah.
Was that really the plan? Was it just a ruse? And either way, is it something that they should have made good on? That they didn't? And what are the repercussions of that, if any? That's my first question.
Okay. So I have two different answers to that. And they probably actually are interrelated. The first is something which Rabbi Soloveitchik taught, and the second one is something which is from the Vilna Gaon. Part of what I suspect is that perhaps Rav Soloveitchik was aware. Again, don't get upset when I say perhaps we're not. It's a Vilna Gaon in a very obscure place, and it's a commentary to the Tukune Zohar. I just don't know if Rav Soloveitchik learned such things or not, and maybe it's not nice that I say that, because my general approach with him is that he knew everything, but there was a limit to everything that he knew, which means he knew anything which was on the page of the Gemara. He knew anything which was in that book of the Talmud Bavli. He knew. He wouldn't necessarily know every single achron that was published. He knew what they had access to. Growing up sometimes in a small town. Actually, Rabbi Soloveitchik was born in a town called Prushin. And today is January 28th. On January 28th, 29th, and 30th, Prushin was emptied out, and all the people were brought to Auschwitz. Those that had still survived were brought out to Auschwitz. One of the reasons I know this is because my grandfather was also born there. So, as a young child, you have to think, okay, what books were available in Prussian? But very quickly, when he was a little bit older, he moved to even a much smaller town, Chaslovich. So how big is a library in Chaslovich? So when you come to things like this, so did he know this? Any tradition of the Vilna Gaon, there was a good chance he knew. And if he did know it, then it just makes everything I'm going to say now, I think, much more interesting. So first, what Rabbi Soloveitchik said. He said that sometimes the Torah presents things in a way that things should be, which means there's the reality, and then there is what actually happens. So when Moshe turns to Pharaoh and says, let my people go, and we want to go serve God in the desert. So what should Pharaoh had said? Now, I think that we realize that the Pharaoh here is not the same Pharaoh who first met Yosef. It just seems to be too many years have gone by. But just think about that for a second. When that Pharaoh meets Yosef and Yosef says, listen, your dream or dreams, it means really one dream, and this is what it means, and you're about to make a lot of money. There's going to be good years, there's going to be bad years. That Pharaoh doesn't say, the first Pharaoh doesn't say, who is God? I don't know him. I never heard of him. Rather, what he says, wow, okay, what do we do now? And essentially, Yosef says, you're about to make a lot of money. Let's open up retail stores, and we're going to do something incredible. And I want to go a little bit deeper on that. Someone else with that kind of information would have utilized it in order to conquer the entire Middle East. No one else will have food. We can just conquer everything. And instead of using might, Yosef gave an incredible lesson. And Yosef's lesson was, no, let's spread the wealth and we're going to make money along the way, but let's create a society where we take care of others. The way Rabbi Soloveitchik put this is that when Yaakov understood that in Egypt they're selling food, he said, who in the world has the values of Avram Avinu in trying to make this world a better place? How did Egypt, of all places, get this? And little did he know, of course, that it was he who did this. It was Yaakov's protege. It was Yosef who was taking the teachings of Avram Avinu and applying them on a national level. But that whole introduction is really important because that now has to be contrasted with our new Paro. And our new Paro, and maybe there's a series of new Paros then, who, there's too many Jews then, let's execute them. Let's get a final solution. Let's go and kill all the males. Let's throw them into the river, and so on and so forth, which means even though there was a Yosef who, and Yosef teaches about a God, and that's what's really important. In that first meeting, Paro was speaking about Elokim and somebody who has Ruach Elokim and so on. And now you have Paro acting in, or these series of Paros acting in such a malicious way, ready to do genocide and not ready to do anything which is positive. And what Rav Soloveitchik said is that when Moshe gets there and he says to Paro, God sent us and it's time for us to go serve God, which means what Paro should have said, I've been waiting for this for a while. I have a tradition that there is such a God who did wonderful things for the Egyptian economy. Please go serve that God. Please, as it were, go to Sinai, receive the Torah. Please bring it back to us. Teach us, elevate us, make the world a place full of knowledge, and then continue, and then go back and continue to Eretz Yisrael, which means he should have said, I want the revelation, not just, at the end of the day, he says, okay, pray for me as well, or, bring offerings for me as well. No, Paro should have been able to say, please don't go straight to Israel, come back and teach us, elevate us, make this world a better place, and then go and continue, your destiny. Essentially, what Rabbi Soloveitchik is suggesting is that this should have been the prototype for the eventual Messianic age. And that's where I want to pause now. Because, we all know these things like, we were redeemed in Nisan, we'll be Nisan in the future. Why? Because apparently the leaving of Egypt is the prototype for the future Geula. Now, what happens in the future Geula? In the future Geula, is it just a Jewish thing? Just the Jewish Messiah comes? Or is this going to be a world thing? So Paro represents a world leader. So what happens to a world leader at the time of redemption? Does he say, I'm not letting you go. I don't want redemption. I don't want this to happen. Or does he say, please go, bless me and teach me and elevate me, and we all want to be a part of it as well? The other part of the story, which is really interesting, and this is Pshat, not just a Midrash, that Paro's daughter ends up leaving. It says it in Divrei Yamim. She ends up leaving. So that also is something, there's like this slight victory in terms of a larger, shall we say, impact. Now, we know between the two of us that doesn't happen. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't leave that in the text itself as, no, this is what should happen. You should ask for 3 days, and he should say, absolutely 3 days. Now, when Moshe takes out the Erev Rav, that's also a good thing. Meaning it's not a bad thing. It just doesn't work out well, which means we need to be a little bit more sophisticated in the way we look at things. So now I want to pause a second and tell you what the Vilna Gaon said. The Vilna Gaon said, please compare the texts between Yaakov leaving Lavan and Moshe leaving Paro. And he says, if you start to look at it, you'll realize that every single thing about the two are absolutely the same, and all the details are the same. At face value, it's not everything is the same. On face value is they both leave, and after 3 days, the protagonist or antagonist hears about it and then takes up chase. But there is an end of the story, which is very different. And by the way, now once you realize that, you'll then see that Yaakov leaving Lavan is the prototype for Am Yisrael leaving Paro. But what's the difference between the two? Lavan catches up and ends up making a contract with him, making some kind of an agreement with him. And therefore, there is this understanding between the two of them. In the story of Egypt, Paro doesn't do that, and Paro and his army ends up dead. So, by the way, realize another thing. Just throw this out because it's connected to the Shira. What does Lavan say? Had I known you were leaving, I would have made a party for you and I would have sent musical instruments. And now you see the musical instruments over here that the women took out. Where did they get that from? Where did they get this idea you're supposed to take out the musical instruments? So now, guess what? We have to give our credit to Lavan, because Lavan is the first one who articulated, when you leave and you become redeemed and you become liberated, then you celebrate. And how do you celebrate? You celebrate with song and dance and music. And that actually is implemented. So I gave a class on this once. I have a shir on this once recorded. I don't know how many connections I found between the two different things, around 15 different things. But just now go back to my first point, is that now we have two different examples of leaving, which really are using the same template. But even though they use the same template, they work out very differently, which now go back to the first point of Rabbi Soloveitchik, that in the future redemption, which now we have two templates for it. So what happens to the world leader? Does he end up, because of his own arrogance, sinking into the river or the sea? Or does he end up marching off with us and saying, no, I'm not letting you go because I want enlightenment as well?
Right. I was wondering because, I mean, a lot of the narrative, I think, from the beginning of Shemot till now, I think has a lot to do also with process and growth, both of the Mitzrim and of the Jewish nation. And I was thinking that it could really have been perhaps that they might have had this ability to first go, and it'd be part of this process that they were going to go and they would serve God, and there would be some sort of a Kiddush Hashem, an acknowledgement of God on the point of power. Not necessarily, I think of course, they would end up leaving and going to the promised land, but not exactly maybe at that point in time before there was a transformation, like you said. And like I articulated before, I do think that every point in time is a possibility for Geula that Paro and the world missed out on, and maybe they weren't ready yet, whatever. But be that as it may, so your answer is soothing to me in that there was the possibility of that being the case. But now I want to go to the second part of the question is, regardless, we didn't see any evidence of them doing this. And so the first answer that would pop into my mind when I thought about that is, well, of course they didn't. They were locked in between the Egyptians chasing after them. And, it wasn't exactly a time to start, bringing sacrifice and Hodul Hashem. But then I was thinking, it appears to me after reading the narrative that, it says, and Paro was told, Ki barach ha'am, that now the nation ran away. And I'm thinking that it is probably at the point where it was already, the opportunity had passed. They had this opportunity after have left a certain amount of time to make good on this, serving of God. And at that point, however he saw it, however he was told, whether it be in sorcery or spies or whatever, that the third day was, and they weren't bringing sacrifices to God. Then he knew they're not doing this. They're going. They didn't have any sign, any evidence of serving God, and perhaps that's how he knew and started running after. And it's at that point in time where it says Hashem tells Moshe that they should turn back and they should go and camp and where they're going to be trapped between when the Mitzrayim run after them and the sea. And so perhaps because at that point in time they didn't do what they were supposed to do, that this had to be the next stage. This had to be the way of making a Kiddush Hashem, the way of God showing his greatness, because the Jewish people didn't do it through their own actions, which they should have perhaps done. And it just always disturbed me. I remember discussing with you in the next power we had once we've discussed Yitro, and then when Yitro comes on the scene and he hears of all the greatness, he brings these sacrifices and says how great is God, and fills that lacking. And it was disturbing to me when we hear about him having done it, and we don't hear about our nation, who was told from the beginning by God that this was something that they were supposed to do. So for me, I see a huge void, a huge missed opportunity. And I want to know, is this something that you see also? Is it something that's discussed? Is it problematic in your eyes?
I don't think it's problematic. And also my suspicion is, and this is something we could discuss a bit about last week's Parsha, but my suspicion is by the time they left, Pharaoh told them, go, I don't want to see you anymore. I don't believe that at the very end when Pharaoh released them, that he was saying it's only for 3 days. I just don't read it like that. I think Pharaoh just wants them out already because there was too much death, and he realizes at that point that these are not people that he needs. This is a losing proposition. So I'm not convinced that once they leave that there was anything wrong with them than just marching on. I don't think there's any misinformation. I think there's two different stages. One stage is let us go for 3 days, and Pharaoh says no. Let us go for 3 days, and Pharaoh says no. And finally, Pharaoh says just go. I don't want you anymore. And then once Pharaoh realizes and internalizes, wow, I just let them go. At that point, he goes chasing after them because he's the one who has regret. But I don't think that the actual leaving of Egypt was done with any kind of dishonesty. I think it was done whereby it got to the point where Pharaoh just completely releases them. Then there's this beautiful midrash that Pharaoh actually came in the middle of the night to them and say, go. And Moshe says, no, we're going to go in the morning, which means Moshe's first exercise of his own liberty is defying Pharaoh and saying, no, we're not going to go when you tell us to go. We're going to go when God tells us to go. And God had said, no one leave the house all night until the morning. So in the morning is when they actually leave. So that's why it's a little complicated. And this is both in terms of machshava and in terms of halacha, which means at which point do they become free? So are they free when they leave Egypt? That's in the morning. Or are they free when Pharaoh sets them free? And that's at night. So there are different elements over here, or different parts of the process, which itself I think is very important. You mentioned before the issue of growth. That's very important. I think part of becoming free is to understand that you're free, even if you don't act on that yet. Just the internalization, the understanding that you have, agency, that you have an ability of making decisions and you can do something, whether you act on it or not, is itself something which is quite liberating. So they were already liberated the night before, even though they actually leave in the morning. So my suspicion is that there was nothing dishonest about them going on. But the second point that I think we have to take into consideration is that all the way back by the burning bush, when the first quote unquote sign that he gives, that God gives, is that when you leave, you will serve God on this mountain, which means the whole idea of serving God was here at Sinai, at the Sneh, which becomes Sinai, Har Elokim, Chorev. So till they get there, which means there's two different issues here. One issue is the time element. The other issue is location. So therefore, especially in a number of midrashim where we see this connection between Sinai to the Mishkan, to eventually the Beit HaMikdash, to Yerushalayim, that there's even one beautiful midrash that says, where did Sinai come from? So it says that God separated the challah from the isa. I hope you baked your challah yet, that you separate the challah, and that's the part which is kadosh. So God took the challah from the place from Har Moriah, and he put it in the desert, and therefore the Midrash is saying that Sinai and Har Moriah are ultimately the same place. And actually in the narrative between, a little under the surface, the narrative of the Akedah has a lot of similarity to Matan Torah, because it's ultimately it's the same place. So therefore you can't separate between the mandate they were given to go and to serve God, bring korbanot, and so on, from the location that they were told they had to do it, and that location is Har Sinai. But if you look at the map and see how they traveled, they did not travel in the most direct way to get there. They ended up going in a place which was a peninsula where they were landlocked, where they could not move at all, and that's where the Egyptians, when they chase them down, are completely convinced that they have them completely trapped now. And that's when the sea splits, and that's when they're able to get and cross over into the desert. So therefore, I wouldn't separate the location, because now I'll just reframe it. It's like saying, hold it, why don't we bring a korban, in the Beit HaMikdash? Well, no, you need the location. You have to get to the Beit HaMikdash. You can't just bring a korban someplace else. So therefore, Har Sinai, while Matan Torah took place, has a status of the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore it's only there that they can bring the korbanot till the Mishkan is built. And then the Mishkan becomes the holiness from Har Sinai. Again, the Ramban of the very end of Shemot talks about this, how the holiness at Sinai morphs into the holiness in the Mishkan, and then that will continue with them on the way, obviously till they get to Eretz Yisrael, and then it's going to eventually get its place back into Yerushalayim. So therefore, you just can't separate location from the korbanot.
So I thought a little bit about that, but it was hard for me to be thoroughly convinced that the sign that he says, "And you will serve me on the mountain," is
on this mountain.
Because I don't necessarily know if they have to be the same thing. And before they became an established place to serve God, we see the Avot bringing korbanos or sacrifices or gratitude to Hashem in different places, and it wasn't quite established yet. And I don't understand how. I feel like the nation, and this will lead probably into one of the other things I wanted to discuss. They have a disconnect between what's done for them and what's expected of them, and a lack of show of gratitude, expectations without anything on their part. And I feel like this all plays into that. And I do feel that it should have been, we have finally, thank God, when there's an Az Yashir, then they break into, I guess, spontaneous song. But why isn't there the overwhelming sense of gratitude to God before then for the unbelievable amount, unstable, do you hear me?
Yes.
For the unbelievable amount of chesed that God has showed to the nation. And there was, and you don't see any sort of gratitude from the people. I feel like they're just kind of they're watching wide-eyed and expect things. And you see that when we get into the next narratives with when it comes to the water, and there's also what I see a progression, I should say, not progress. They're actually going down from a higher level to a lower level in their complaints when it happens with the water. Because, and in the first point, when they don't have water, they say manishta, right? That was their big thing. And then they go from a simple manishta the first time to nu lanu mayim, into a command, give us water. And then we're told at the second time, and then we're told that they even said hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu, and that was like they're just going from, now they expect stuff with no gratitude, with no prayers to God. And Moshe hinted to them a few times when he reprimanded them, why are you complaining to us? Why are you complaining? Who manachnu, he says about him and Aaron. Why are you complaining to us? You're complaining against God. And I think the hint in there is, you have an ability, you have an obligation, you have to recognize it comes from God, and you have to complain, really, hopefully via davening in a respectful manner, and request from God instead of going into full force complaining and crying out. And they were told that in the first place, and it just fell on deaf ears, and then they went into full blown, well, is God even with us? And I just think that there's they haven't proven themselves to even be worthy. They look like ungrateful children is the only way I know how to phrase it. And to me, this all goes back in the fact that they didn't even show gratitude for what God did. We don't see any of that. Why not?
Careful about laying more blame at the feet of the Jewish people than what the text clearly says or what Chazal tell us about. One of the things that the Arizal pointed out is he understood that the word Pesach is Posach. Now they began the ability to speak, which means there was a silence for them. And part of the silence is being a slave. And what you seem to be ignoring along the way over here is the slave mentality, and the slave mentality is going to go with this whole generation all the way till we finally get to the realization that this generation who were slaves will not be the same generation who are going to be able to enter into the land and capture land and build the land and so on. That the being a slave means something. Being a slave, Vaichik had pointed out, is that how the Seder itself tries to take you to an anti-slave mentality, which means very often in slave communities, there really is no sense of family. It's like just a whole bunch of people, and therefore, no, sit together as a family. A slave, in terms of halacha, is somebody who's not able to give any testimony. So over here, no, please speak over to your children and tell your children over what has happened over here. And he gave a number of other examples how the process itself of the Seder night was meant in order to, again, allow us to speak. Teach us to speak, teach us about family, teach us about responsibilities, and so on. The issue is that when we are, for so long, have had this has been we're expecting, like in a day, become free people who know how to speak. One of the things, go back to, unfortunately, a discussion about the Holocaust. If you think about the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, which was really, really, for the most part, was something which was profound, and how Jews went to marches and so on. Now you think, on the other hand, about the Jewish Peter Bergson, Hillel Cook. Do you have any idea who that person is? It's the same guy. Peter Bergson and Hillel Cook is the same person. Hillel Cook is a nephew of Rav Cook, and he changed his name when he came to America to Peter Bergson. Almost everything that happened in terms of response to be able to speak up about the plight of Jews who were in Europe because they don't have voices yet. I mean, it's fascinating. We did not have voices to be able to protest in order to about the treatment of the Jews in Poland and in Hungary, and especially in Germany and Austria and so on. And how millions of people were being killed. The American Jewish community was not able to speak. And here I'm not talking about a community that were former slaves. It's just a community that didn't feel that they had this significant level of independence to be able to make demands from their congressman or congresswoman, or from the senator, or for that matter, from the president. There was, like, one time 150 rabbis marched on Washington. My great-grandfather was one of those rabbis, and I have pictures of this. And the president refused to meet with them, sent somebody out to say, okay, we got your message, thank you very much. And that was it. That was pretty much the response to the Holocaust. So you're here going back and saying, hold it, these people the phrase of children, what we expect of our children. Well, God willing, our children were born very, very differently than they were born. And we train and teach our children certain things that they need to do and to experience. And now we have a problem. It's a mess. It's a phenomenal problem. And that is, how do you move people, not just geographically from Egypt to Israel via Sinai, but how in the world do you take people from generations of slavery and within a society that worshiped all types of idols and polytheism, and take them and turn them into monotheists who are going to be able to again, be dignified and understand exactly what it is that they need to do. That process is not an easy process. And I agree with you that, a careful reading of this week's Parsha Moshe, again, being appointed by God, is a wonderful teacher. Sometimes progress is not always in a predictable, path that everything goes forward, and sometimes we go back a bit. But by the way, that's what happened in Egypt as well. The first step, go to Pharaoh, tell him let me free, and Pharaoh let the people be free. And what does Pharaoh say? Okay, I'm not giving you any straw anymore. I'm not giving you any of the resources. Go do it by yourself. And we move backwards a little bit. This, by the way, is also part of the discussion in terms of the future or maybe present Geula. Is everything going to be in one trajectory, going in one direction? Or is there going to be 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, and then maybe sometimes 3 steps forward and 4 steps back? But, what happens? Do you stop at each moment and then say, hold it, we're not going in the right place? Or do you look in terms of moving from a people who were spread all over this world to a people who now the populations are concentrated in, really a couple of places. And the main concentration is really over here right now. And as much as, sometimes I know that you're not, but sometimes we as a community are very Ashkenazic centric. And you look at the Jews in the Sephardic countries, in the Middle Eastern countries, and essentially you have almost a complete move of those populations. So if you would have said 200 years ago, hold it, how are we going to move all these Jews back to Israel? Well, that really has happened. Has every single step in this along the way has been going forward, or we had some steps going backwards? Of course, we had steps going backwards, and that's really what happens a lot in this week's Parsha. And even when they say, "Is God with us or not?" I'm not convinced that they are rejecting God's existence. No. What I think is that they're saying, if God is with us, then there is a price to be paid when God, at the very beginning of the Parsha, when God says, "I'm not taking you derech eretz plishtim," he doesn't tell them this, right? He says this. This is an editorial statement. God says, "I'm not going to take them derech eretz plishtim," which means go up the coast, which means you always have water, you always have fish. Most likely there are birds going to be in that area, which means there's going to be lots of resources. Most likely, I don't know the exact enough about the terrain, but they say that all the rivers go to the sea. So if that's the case, you probably have a lot of fresh water also, which is along the line you're going to find, which is going towards the sea. So if they would have gone up the coast, it would have taken a lot less time. It would have taken a couple of days. And they would have had all kinds of resources, which means there wouldn't have been a necessity for God then to micromanage and to give them the well, or to give them, so forth, which then. So when God's possibly been self-reliant, I am going to take them instead into the desert. And in the desert, they are going to need God for every single thing that they do. And when you get a chance afterwards, take a look at the 2nd chapter in Yirmiyahu. There's a little reference to this as well.
Right. I still have a very hard time, because I understand the slave mentality, and it's not that I don't cut them a lot of slack. I do. I really do. And I see that God does at certain points in time. I really am strictly going from the narrative and from what I believe that I see to be their capabilities. And I do think that even with a slave mentality, or maybe even especially with a slave mentality, when you're given such gifts, there should be some sort of a natural reaction. The song and the dance that they had in Az Yashir and Miriam, and and everything that they do, it's a natural response of gratitude. And I think that even if, or like I said, especially if you're a slave and you're given such gifts, that it's bound to come out, that simcha, somewhere in a visual manner. And it doesn't even have to be in speech. It could be in other ways. But the fact that they've done, that they can do it, that they did do it at the splitting of the sea, that they did make, by the Chet HaEgel, they show abilities to do certain things. I don't like to speak negative either, and I wouldn't, unless it's something that really I feel is a lot of arrows pointing to me, and I only do it in terms of a learning lesson. And what I think that we should all learn, no matter what our matzav is, no matter what shibud that we're going through, is to look for the things that are positive and try and focus on those. And it's not even like they were enslaved anymore. They weren't enslaved anymore. And I know that God couldn't slack the whole time that they were enslaved. But here, given all these gifts and leaving with great abundance and with great signs and with great wonders, there should have been, and I feel that there was some sort of a disconnect, and I think that that's even proven when it says Az Yashir. It took till that moment there was something missing, but I feel like they had connected at the splitting of the sea. They connected with something great that they could have held on to, but they let it go. And maybe that's part and parcel of years of abuse, and okay, I can understand that. But I do think that there's a difference between going from you should have brought Olot and Zvachim to a statement of Hayesh Hashem B'Kirbeinu. And I don't think they were denying God's existence at all. I think it was even worse. You want to deny that God exists, you don't believe that God exists, you can't help what you believe. But to say, yes, God exists, but is he really with us, when they didn't do any actions to warrant it? Where did we see when you're missing something? What I really like when it says the first time that they didn't have water, it says hamayim, because they were marim, and marim, the same word as Miriam. And the way I really saw that very nice and metaphorically is the waters were just like Miriam, like she was that potential to just take a situation and to turn it around through faith. And that whenever God gives you something, that if it's something negative, it's a moment that can be transformative, and that they should be learning that, and I think that when God says after, when he shows them with the bitter waters by turning it sweet, by taking the tree and throwing it in, that he says Ani Hashem Rifa'echa. So what he's trying, I think that it was a dafka, it was part of the plan that they shouldn't have had the water. It was a demonstration from God that things aren't always what you see in its inherent situation, and what makes something go from one opposite to the other is God, who has that ability to turn things around. So how's that going to happen? How's God going to turn things around? That's where you, man, come in, and that's where you need to do your part, whatever it is, via action, via prayer, via something besides complaining. And then getting from the complaining, going from bad to worse, was really, I think, was really disconcerting.
I think you're being unfair.
Yeah.
I think you're being unfair because, again, there's a total setup over here.
Yeah.
Just to go backwards a second. One, they are terrified until the splitting of the sea, when the Egyptians drown. Then they realize that their adversary.
Rose.
So they're being terrified is very important in this. Once that terror has lifted, then they can sing. So then they switch from one terror to a new terror. The new terror they switch to is one of lack of resources. And I'll say it again. I think there were some things along the way that you're 100% correct, that this is definitely part of a plan. But I'm just not sure to what extent there should be blame over here, because God put them in a situation that they have no resources, which means the only thing they can do is they can scream to God and say, God, give me water, give me food, give me something.
They didn't scream to God. That's the problem. And I feel like, before you go to screaming, there's little steps. We don't see any progression. It goes from not having to panic. And what I want to say is, to my own defense, is that Moshe was also seen to be not happy with the people's response. He's like, why are you complaining to me and Aaron? Like, what is he trying to say in that? He's trying to say something, right? Ma nachnu. What is he trying to say by that? What's the point? I think there's a point there trying to be made. And it doesn't sound like he's pleased with them. And he says, Od ma'at, they're going in another little bit, they're gonna stone me to death, and why are they're looking at Moshe, Moshe is God's representative. And so why is he saying that? Like, I just feel like Moshe's displaying his displeasure, and that he's trying to communicate some message. But you don't feel that by his response?
Well, by the way, they do scream to God very early in the Parsha. When Pharaoh was coming, it says, "Vayitz'aku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem."
Yes, yes. I think that they started good and they went downhill from there,
Right,
right?
right. So that's exactly what I said. Is that
Yeah.
you're expecting the trajectory to go completely in one direction,
I hear
but
you.
but it's also interesting that they speak to God, but they also complain to Moshe. Right then, you have a problem. V'yitz'aku b'nei Yisrael Hashem. Right. This is Yudalid. That was Yud, and then in Yudalid, Vayomer el Moshe, Hamali in Klarim b'Mitzrayim. Like, why did you take us out? They scream to God, but they say to Moshe, maybe this was a very bad plan that you did over here. But then in Pasuk Tedvav, Moshe responds, God will do it. Yomer Shema Moshe, Ma titzak alai. Titzak over there, if you look at the Targum, is prayer. Why are you praying to me? Act, do something. Go ahead, move forward, and so on, and proceed. I don't need your prayer. I just wonder also, I'm wondering out loud, how much that statement of God, matitzakalai, do something, why that becomes, how that becomes interpreted. But I'm going to say it again. There is, the larger question over here is, what is God trying to accomplish by virtue of taking us in a place that we have no resources, and the only way that we're going to be able to survive is by virtue of getting things from God. Again, there is clearly, again, in my mind, there's clearly an attempt to develop emunah, to develop faith, and that's why God chose to take them in this particular way. So now if you're going to say, but hold it, the faith doesn't happen immediately, and why aren't they responding better? So again, that's what God is doing. God said these people need this lesson of faith along the way, and apparently again, this is a problem constructed by God based upon the geographical choice of where they're going. As far as solution to the problem, there are various solutions. One is God could have created a river there, and no one would have been the wiser. Hold it, it's so interesting. There's a river going through. God could have had wheat fields over there in the middle of the desert. The same way that you can bring food down from heaven, you can create wheat fields in the middle of a desert as well, which means food could have suddenly presented itself in other ways. Instead, what God is doing is in order to make sure that they understand that bread comes from heaven. Now, by the way, the challenge then is for us today, for the farmer today, to say, hold it, I have another partner in all this. Yes, I planted. Yes, I harvested, and I did this, but ultimately, no, bread comes from. Hold it a second. They needed to learn this. Why didn't they learn this immediately? And why are they more appreciative? I'm not going to say it again. God is saying they need this lesson. They need this lesson. They obviously need to be able to internalize this. One of the things that I'm not going to say drives me crazy, but I find it continually shocking is all the bad things that happen in the desert, how they have this disconnect. And by the way, take every single case now, be it the morning that they made the golden calf, they ate mun from heaven. The morning that the Meraglim came back, they're sitting there and they're munching on their mun sandwiches. When Datan Vaviram, when they have their rebellion, Korach and so on, and it's saying to Moshe, who are you? And so on. They're all eating mun along the way, which means at every step of the way, God has provided for them bread coming from heaven. And how in the world does this little minor point about God providing all of these things for them allow them to do all of the terrible things they do throughout the desert? So apparently, and again, I'm not going to say that I don't blame them at all, but I'm saying apparently there is this disconnect and there is this need to internalize what is taking place. See, I also find there's another subtext. And by the way, I don't know if you ever saw this in my first book in Explorations. I have the whole chapter on this week's Parsha is on this point that you're bringing up. It's all on this issue. But one of the things that happens, which I find so interesting, is that there are constantly lessons as well, and not just providing for what they think they need. which means, again, we need bread. And God says, sure, man is going to fall from heaven 6 days of the week. And on the seventh, it's not going to fall. You need in a meaningful way right over here. Shabbos, when it was introduced all the way back in Bereshit, had nothing to do with humans. God created for 6 days, God rested on the seventh. It's totally what we would say theocentric. Only has to do with God, has nothing to do with man. And now something has happened, is that God is saying, oh yeah, by the way, this is like someplace in the middle. By the way, I work for 6 days. In a certain sense, I rest on the seventh. So the mun factory is closed and you're not getting anywhere, but don't worry, I'll take care of you. I'll give you double on Friday. Now, that's such an interesting thing, because what did they think they needed? They thought they needed bread. And what does God give them? God gives them Shabbat. That's fascinating. And that takes you, to the earlier section. We need water. The water's bitter. Okay, take this thing and sweeten the water. But what else does it say there? Visham samochoku mishpat. That over there they get something else as well. And that brings us to this whole thing. Ein mayim elo Torah. They traveled 3 days without Torah. They traveled 3 days without, something was missing. But along the way, every filled with not just a physical, solution, but will also have what I think is a spiritual, religious, or other kind of need, even intellectual, being fulfilled as well. And that's also a thing you need to keep your eye on as you go through the rest of the parsha.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. It was a question in my mind, and you brought it up, so I'll ask you. You said by the Mayim where it says there he did chok mishpat. I was wondering what's chok referring to there? Like, where do you see chok in that incident? Because I wasn't clear on what that meant.
Well, if you look at Rashi claims he taught them the law of paraduma right then, which is like, hold it, paraduma right now. But there may be a deeper point to that paraduma, again, according to many, God both. There could be, part of the chok world is that certain things happen. And by the way, the scary part of the paraduma thing is saying there's going to be a situation where there will be death, and this is how death is dealt with. And again, that's something which is a little frightening, but that also gets to the deeper point of the ultimate chok is not just death, there's also tzaddik v'ralo and so on. So the Alshach goes in that direction, that he was already teaching them, preparing them, that there are things in this world that you will not be able to understand, and like tzaddik v'ralo, and therefore there's going to be a need for paraduma, and therefore again getting to a deeper level to be able to internalize and take. It's not just, the bread comes from heaven or the water comes from God. Look, there's going to be other things in this world that you're going to need to learn here along the way as well.
Okay, that really works for me. I wanted to ask you just before we leave, because I can't leave without bringing up Miriam and the Az Yashir, and I wanted to know what you thought in the interpretation of the differences between, well, two questions. First of all, we know that the Az Yashir, there's the element of future, where they say that it's a song that also pertains to the future, but the fact is, it did say Az Yashir then, and that's a future tense. And the way that Moshe and the maybe males, depending on who you ask, sang it, and then Miriam after. Now, there's two questions I have on that also. So Miriam's, there's two distinct differences. Is hers is said in the present tense, and then I also wanted to know, because of course you hear how Miriam sang with the song and dance with the women, but it does say bata'an lahem, and so in my head there seems something more about the nation. I mean, I guess the extreme right can say there were maybe male children there under the age of bar mitzvah. I mean, I'm guessing that's how they would answer it, but was there more of some sort of a leadership ability, not just ability, a leadership aspect that Miriam had that didn't just pertain to the women that's alluded to in that lahem, or do you think I'm reading too much into that?
I think the issue of I'm not going to get involved with. There are people far more knowledgeable Az Yashir is one of the proofs of a messianic age and of other things in the future, but it's also possible that Yashir is a present future. It's a present moving towards future, which Hebrew does sometimes. As far as the singing itself, I think, in this case, we actually have to get much more basic before we get to bigger ideas. The Nitziv already suggests that there was a song with a refrain. And the refrain was Ashir El Hashem, right? Kiga Aga. That was a refrain all the way along the way. And therefore, it's Moshe Ubnei Yisrael that Moshe is singing. And then there's this response of Ashir Hashem Kiga Aga. And then you have Miriam leading the women in the response as well. There was one comment, I'm trying to think who it was. Maybe it was the Shadal, because he's pretty radical. I think he said that they had sung together as a chorus, that you need the sopranos and you need the tenors, and therefore it was convinced that your Beis Yaakov teacher would necessarily accept that. But I think we should just think about the singing elements of it first. And therefore this idea that Miriam identifies the chorus, and therefore it's done in response. Like even when we say Hallel, there is, at some point, some response as well. And I think that that's really what's going on. So if you want, you could then say that you have two different Shliach Tzibors over here. One Shliach Tzibor who's singing for the men and then getting them to do the refrain. And then you have Miriam who's leading the same thing taking place with the women who are then singing and giving the same refrain. But the main difference is, as we saw, is that we also see this movement and the music, and we see the musical instruments, and we see the dancing which is taking place. And therefore, what Miriam was able to do, turn it into just a voice thing, into a full body experience. Kol atzmotai tomarna Hashem. I'm going to speak and I'll serve God with my entire being, my entire body. So that seems to be, what Miriam is doing. So, it's interesting. Miriam, who is so connected to water, going to the mikveh is one of the mitzvot that you can do with your entire body. So she is now somebody who's using her entire body to be able to serve God in terms of the voice, but with the dancing and the movement and the music. So you see a much more of a full body integrated experience taking place.
Right. I just feel with Miriam and how she is, I feel that the fact that it's Shiru and that it's present is that it seems to me that it was always, her faith is something that was always present. That when she's singing the shir and it says Shiru, it's something that was there, from the beginning to the end throughout. And it wasn't contingent upon any, proof that had to be at any certain point in time, as opposed to a different way of the nation that we haven't got there yet. We have to work on the Muna, we have the Man in order to, facilitate that. But I feel like that's something that Miriam really represents, is this faith that's always there, whether it's being proven or not. And to me, that's really the way I see that present tense, as opposed to the future, is that for the maminim that are that she represents, that there are people that are just always faithful, no matter what the situation is. But then again, I don't know if it's just yeah.
Or when she, I think you can see Miriam's faith more when she refuses to turn her back on her brother, in a much earlier scene. I think in that sense, it's more impressive. Over here, again, I'm just reading the words. Vatikach Miriam Neviah, Chot Aaron, et atov biyada. She takes, again, if you will, the tambourine. Vateitze kol hanashim achareha, and the women follow her, bitupim uvachalot, with their tambourines and dancing. Vata'an lahem Miriam, and then she responds. Vata'an, it's a response. Vata'an lahem Miriam, shiru laHashem, sing to God, ki ga'ol ga'ah. And again, I'm not sure why I would really read that much into it. I'm saying on a pshat level.
Yeah.
You want to say other things which are deeper, fine. It just seems to me. And to say these words, right? Shira Hashem ki gogasus v'kol ramabayam. But I'm saying what I'm most impressed with is that it's being done not just in a verbal sense, but it's being done in a full body sense.
Right. But I think the point that I'm trying to make that I'm not articulating well enough is the fact that her, even if hers was in a response with the refrain, the way that the Torah puts it with the Azashir, and then it says it gives us Miriam, and that Miriam's is in the present tense, is I feel like it's trying to tell us that that's part and parcel of what Miriam was trying to give over to the nation, was to keep that song going. Shiru, don't just let it be Azashir as we're crossing. Shiru, continue this song, continue this refrain, continue this in your Amunah, keep it there and continue singing this song. Like, I feel like that's why it comes out, is like she's trying to have them to hang on to this moment, to bring it with them. And then that's why it comes after with the main chorus. So it's something they should incorporate into their very being. And it's something that she's trying to facilitate the nation in doing.
Right. But if anything, you should have said that about the Uz Yashir, which is more likely future oriented.
Well, the reason why I don't say us is because I'm always about that, that moment, right? We're supposed to live in the moment and not wait it out and say, okay, we will sing it then, but we should be singing it at every point in time, kind of like the Baruch Dayanim Tova Meitiv. It's when there's a Muna, it's all one and it's all in the present kind of tense. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Anyway, I hope, I'm sorry that we broke up a lot. I'm not sure how this is taped for our audience. But I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me and bringing to light a lot of concepts. And thank you. Thank you for always being so generous with your time.
Okay, so have a Shabbat Shalom and Bezrat Hashem. Ad hapam haba.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.